In October 2011, a familiar face became a headline in newspapers and on television, seen bleeding, very weak, and being beaten by the people after being pulled out from a dirty sewer, a place very far from his luxurious lifestyle and the billion-dollar palace that had been his home for many years. And this was no other than the well-known Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, who ruled that country for a long time and placed Libya among the richest countries in Africa. But how did his life end up in such a tragic situation? What was his mistake that became the cause of his violent and terrible death? This is the rise, fall, and final moments of Muammar Gaddafi. But before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's already a big help for us content creators. Thank you. In 1959, the people of Libya discovered that behind the dusty deserts and rocky mountains, their country was actually hiding a treasure, the biggest oil reserve in all of Africa. But instead of growing rich, like the countries in the Middle East that are rich in oil and crude, the whole country stayed poor because their leader at that time, King Idris, did not take care of the nation. He allowed the Americans and the British to control the oil, and more than that, his leadership was full of corruption. As the years passed, the Libyan people grew tired of the king's corrupt rule, and one of the people who was unhappy with the situation of their country was Muammar Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi was born and raised in a tribe in the middle of the desert in Sirte, a remote village in Libya. And despite the hard life, he worked hard so he could finish school. Not long after, in 1963, after graduating from the University of Libya, the young man tried entering the Royal Military Academy that was run by the British. But even then, he already felt strong anger toward the Americans and the British because of what he believed was their abuse toward his fellow countrymen. But even with that feeling, he still forced himself to get along with the white people until he finally became a full member of the Libyan military. But his only reason for entering the military was not to serve the king, but his desire to free Libya from the hands of foreign rulers. During his years of service while slowly rising in rank, Gaddafi met other soldiers who, like him, wanted to end the control of the Americans and the British over the wealth of the country, and of course, to end the rule of King Idris. Through his influence, Gaddafi, who was only a military captain at that time, formed a militant group of soldiers planning to rebel against the administration called the Free Officers Movement. But to remove the influence of the foreigners, they first needed to unite so they could remove King Idris from his throne. Even though their plan was already set, they had to wait for the right time to overthrow the king. And the moment they had been waiting for finally came on September 1st, 1969. While King Idris was in Turkey for medical treatment, Muammar Gaddafi launched a military coup to remove King Idris. Because Gaddafi had convinced most of the soldiers and even the whole nation, the uprising became peaceful and there were no bloody encounters until they finally entered the king's palace in Tripoli, Libya. This revolution would be remembered in history and would change the future of Libya. Their uprising was fast and successful in removing the monarchy. And that night, the Free Officers Movement led by Gaddafi raised the flag of freedom and started the change in the country by forming a new leadership. And of course, since he was the one who started all of this, no one hesitated to choose Muammar Gaddafi as the new leader of Libya. Who would have thought that in only 24 hours, a simple soldier who once lived a hand-to-mouth life in the middle of the desert would become the new leader of Libya, the man who would run a country that the whole world wanted because of its oil? The Libyan people looked up to Gaddafi and treated him as a brave hero. When he took the position, he tried to fix the economy and change the system of the whole nation. He removed the US and British army bases and forcefully took full control of the oil compared to the rule of King Idris. With Gaddafi now in power, the Libyans would finally experience true freedom. Libya earned billions of dollars from the tons and tons of oil barrels they exported to different countries. Slowly, Libya began to rise as the new superpower in Africa, and along with this rise came the dream of the people for a peaceful life. Although the country was not yet very developed, Gaddafi gave his people free education, free hospitals, and free housing. There were even reports back then that every family received a dividend from the government's earnings from oil. But the happy days of the Libyans did not last long, and the reason was none other than the very man they considered a hero, Muammar Gaddafi. Over the years, Gaddafi's views slowly changed. The leader who once promoted reform and revolution gradually changed until he became the type of leader he himself had once hated, a dictator. As his leadership grew in the 1970s, Gaddafi began to see himself as a king and sometimes even thought he was a god. Even though he pretended that the people had control of the country, the truth was only he held the power. The former mass-focused nationalist leader slowly became a cruel dictator. As the new supreme leader, his face was spread across every corner of the country, on television, even on the money. All the dictator's propaganda was treated as law in Libya, and all citizens could do nothing but obey. To prevent any other officials from opposing his ideas, Gaddafi banned political parties, and anyone against the administration was watched, and worse, kidnapped, imprisoned, tortured, or even executed. No elections ever took place under Gaddafi. Adding to that, he had connections with various militant groups and terrorists who helped him kill anyone who dared oppose him. Ambition quickly consumed Muammar Gaddafi, and his thirst for recognition, power, and wealth pushed him even further to become a cruel dictator. Under his rule, the Libyans lived in fear and violence. While most Libyans suffered in poverty, Muammar Gaddafi lived in luxury behind the tall walls of his sprawling mansion in the middle of Tripoli. Yet despite this, many citizens still supported Gaddafi, believing he was a good leader, and that the criticisms against him were just the work of foreigners who wanted to control Libya and its oil again. He also became a strong enemy of America, and was even once called a mad dog by former US President Ronald Reagan. For a very long time, Gaddafi stayed in power, enjoying the massive wealth from oil. But all of that would change because of the very people he had abused and oppressed. After more than 4 decades in power, it reached a point where the Libyans were fed up with Gaddafi being a brutal dictator and a corrupt leader. On February 15, 2011, following the successful uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia, the Libyans tried to hold massive protests to remove Muammar Gaddafi. But the dictator did not like this, and instead of listening to his people, he chose to deal with the protests brutally. Everyone on the streets was met with gunfire, tanks, and even airstrikes. It was a huge mistake that only encouraged ordinary citizens to rise against him. By August 2011, Gaddafi's camp did not expect all of his enemies to unite with the mission of overthrowing the dictator. A large-scale war broke out between Gaddafi's loyalists and the rebels, marking the start of a bloody civil war in Libya. Even so, Gaddafi remained strong and stayed in his headquarters in Tripoli, even as the enemies approached. But when he heard the news that the united militants were already at the outskirts of the city, with nothing else to do but remove him, Gaddafi was forced to flee from Tripoli. He was accompanied by his loyal friend and Libya's defense minister, Abu Bakr Yunis, the head of security, Mansour Dao, his son, Mutassim, and a few remaining guards. According to Gaddafi, if everything ended, he wanted it to end in his hometown, in the village of Sirte. That day, they all went to Sirte together, despite the danger waiting for them. For several weeks, Gaddafi hid in abandoned houses. He moved many times out of fear of being spotted by the rebelling people. Meanwhile, Libya remained chaotic because of the civil war and constant fighting. But because of the unrest outside, they had to keep moving from hideout to hideout just to avoid the militant groups. As the days passed, Gaddafi slowly became desperate to regain his throne. He never imagined that the day would come when the Libyans would hate him. While hiding, Gaddafi suffered the same hardships his people had long endured. He had no proper place to sleep, no electricity or lights, and he couldn't even listen to the news on the radio because there was no signal. He never thought he would end up in a situation so far removed from his luxurious life as the feared leader of Libya. The illusion that he could still win the battle began to consume the dictator. But the number of enemies across the Sirte region kept growing, forcing him to leave and look for a new hiding place. On the morning of October 20th, 2011, he was still with his son Mutassim, Abu Bakr Yunis, Mansour Dao, and his bodyguards. They tried to escape from the town of Sirte. This was Gaddafi's only chance to leave and hopefully survive the hands of the angry militants and citizens. They planned to leave at dawn, but because of the many civilian supporters who wanted to join them, it took longer before they finally moved. Around 8:30 in the morning, a convoy of over 50 vehicles and pickup trucks loaded with machine guns and anti-aircraft missiles set off together. One of the trucks carried Gaddafi and his companions. They had only a little time to escape because Gaddafi knew militants were nearby whose only target was to kill him. But as the convoy traveled along the highway, Gaddafi suddenly heard a series of explosions. They had been spotted by troops of NATO who had also intervened to remove his regime. All of NATO's drones and warplanes focused on Gaddafi's long convoy, continuously launching missiles from the air. On top of that, they encountered militant groups from Misurata, longtime enemies of Gaddafi. Gaddafi's forces began to dwindle, especially from the repeated airstrikes. Dozens of his bodyguards lay dead on the road, and the remaining loyalists were barely recognizable because of the injuries they suffered from constant bombing. To temporarily escape the shooting, Gaddafi's group tried hiding in a nearby abandoned house. But even there, they were tracked by their enemies. The thick walls of the mansion could no longer protect them because they were surrounded by armed militants and NATO drones. Everywhere they turned, they were met with gunfire. At that moment, Muammar Gaddafi knew his chances of leaving alive were very small, especially when he heard from Mansour Dao that all their vehicles were destroyed. Because of this, Gaddafi's camp was forced to walk and hide behind concrete blocks scattered along the road. But they knew that the longer they stayed there, the higher the chance the rebels would find them. On one side, Muammar Gaddafi crouched while hiding in a broken guard outpost as bullets rained down on them. Even though fear may have shown on his face, he still seemed ready to fight, wearing a bulletproof vest, helmet, and carrying weapons. With the help of the few remaining soldiers, his son Mutasim tried to find a way for his beloved father to escape. Desperate and terrified, they spotted an open drainage under the highway, only 100 meters from where they were. It was a secret passage that could lead them to a wide farm and possibly be their key to escape. As soon as Gaddafi saw the drainage, he didn't hesitate and ran straight for it. This was their only chance to escape, because everywhere else they went, their enemies were waiting. All the remaining survivors followed Gaddafi into the drainage. But what they didn't know was, this would be their final place. They tried crawling to the other side of the drainage, but as soon as they reached the end, they were spotted by more rebels outside. Gaddafi stayed inside the drainage fighting the rebels with some of his remaining soldiers. One of his bodyguards tried to repel the attackers by throwing grenades. But, as often happens in such situations, the third grenade thrown by the bodyguard hit the cement and bounced back toward them. It happened so fast they couldn't react, and the explosion hit them immediately. The bodyguard's hand was blown off, and Abu Bakr Yunus and Muammar Gaddafi were injured and bleeding from shrapnel. Others, including Mansour Dao, were knocked unconscious by the blast. Because of the grenade, Gaddafi was left in a pitiful state under the drainage. Most of his bodyguards were gone, and no one remained to protect the former dictator of Libya. After a few moments, the rebels slowly approached the drainage and were shocked to see the miserable state of Gaddafi. Some wanted to kill him immediately, but others chose to temporarily save him, wanting to capture the dictator alive. Even drenched in his own blood, he was quickly loaded onto the back of a pickup truck. But the other militants could no longer control themselves and attacked the former dictator. They punched him, kicked him, and some even stabbed him mercilessly, worsening his injuries. After a few minutes, Gaddafi was taken by ambulance to a hospital, bleeding, wounded, unconscious, and almost naked because of the treatment by the rebels. However, only 2 hours later, a hospital in Misrata, Libya declared that Muammar Gaddafi had died, likely due to shrapnel, bullets, and the severe head injuries he sustained. Overjoyed, the Libyans paraded Gaddafi's body outside, making fun of it. It was the signal of the end of Muammar Gaddafi's 42-year dictatorship in Libya. In the final chapter of Muammar Gaddafi's life, the violent and shocking way he died was seen around the world, becoming a symbol of the fall of his long rule. Although many disliked his dictatorship, it cannot be denied that under his government, Libya's education, healthcare and infrastructure improved. Also, his tough stance against Western powers, his plan for African countries to have their own currencies not tied to the dollar or euro, and his control over the country's oil wealth may have contributed to his downfall, leaving the question whether his fate was caused by the uprising from within or simply the desire of foreign powers with interests in Libya's wealth.